Cool.
All right, so this week our webinar is based around the topic of anti-Blackness in education. The first question is, what is dominant versus non-dominant cultural capital? Anybody want to start?
You want to take it?
I can get started. So I started by defining cultural capital as the accumulation of knowledge, behaviors, and skills that one can tap into to demonstrate one's cultural competence and therefore their social status and standing in society. And then the dominant is the higher status group in the culture, and the non-dominant is the lower status group, or as in the article, they called it Black. I thought it was interesting that it seems like it's on the non-dominant, the members of that non-dominant cultural group to feel this or have this responsibility almost to move between the two, which I thought was kind of a unique characteristic.
Yeah, so looking at the article by Carter, cultural capital provides individuals with the ability to walk the walk and talk the talk of the cultural power brokers in society. So that the comment that you made about like how Black people don't have to, but they tend to switch back and forth between non-dominant and dominant. I think it's kind of, the article also said something like if they don't switch back when they're around other Black people, that they'll be like stereotyped as less Black or whatnot. And I just I've seen that actually. One of my best friends in high school, he was Black, and he acted really, really white when he was around like the football team. And not he just was very I don't know. He our coaches all the time said, "Michael, you're the whitest Black kid we know." When a coach says that to you, it's kind of like wow, not to me, but to him. So I saw that with Michael, my friend. He had to go back and forth, and he lived with his mom, who was white, so he was biracial, and his stepdad was white too. So I don't think he ever had the chance to really adapt to his culture if he wanted to choose that Black culture was his culture, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And I read too in the article how it was saying, after reviewing these examples that it gave, it was saying in these examples, the dominant cultural capital is an instrumental or rational purpose, whereas a non-dominant cultural capital has an expressive purpose. And just with those specific examples, and I was yeah, I definitely could see it throughout that, because it's almost like you set, the standards at dominant. It's the rational one, it's the logical one, and then non-dominant can be the opposite because it's just how they're, expressing themselves and whatnot. So I thought it was interesting when I put it that way.
I like in that same article that you guys are talking about, I think it's actually the exact same line you were just referencing, Lily, how it says youth might employ dominant cultural capital to gain academic and socioeconomic mobility. And then on the other hand, it might express in-group affiliation, like you said. And I liked how they didn't associate any race or culture with that, because we can now interpret it the way we think it would be, who we would think the academic and socioeconomic people you would want to affiliate with would look like or act like or be like, versus the in-group affiliation, because it can be different, kind of like Justin was saying.
And at the same time, it also says that that the dominant cultural capital is associated with getting jobs and also just having an education in general. And I think that's the root cause of the problem, is that the dominant culture has taken that place in society, and the non-dominant culture is kind of just kind of how you're giving that example with your friend Justin, what was wrong with him acting white, I feel there shouldn't be anything wrong with that if that's his choice,
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so moving on, how can teachers value Black cultural capital in the classroom?
So this article I'm thinking it's from, which I guess it was the same article that talked about dominant, non-dominant. But after like kind of reading the examples and they talked about how they dress and how a lot of times teachers use that to make assumptions pretty much about their students, especially when it comes to Black and white. So in reading the examples, I just put, and I feel like I've always done this, even though I've had students who, have had 90% Black classrooms. I've had a good mix of everything, but I feel like this is something that I'm good about as a teacher, but just holding the same high expectations for everyone. So Black or white, they walk in the door, don't look at how they dress. Like you don't need to necessarily harp on, like you said, like their dress, their demeanor, but just, their work ethic and their attitude and whatever else. And just set those high expectations for everyone and don't think, oh, because they're Black or have the non-dominant culture, they're not going to work as hard or they're not going to add anything to my class. Like those are just assumptions that have to go out the door.
Yeah. I think like having, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say having high expectations is like a good overarching kind of standard to have for all your students. And then like even beyond that, like getting to know all your students individually as people and like getting through those stereotypes on the outside and then understanding how like understanding that there might be a dissonance of like what my cultural norms are and what my students' cultural norms are and knowing that they're not wrong, like they're just different.
Right. So the biggest thing that I emphasized in answering this question was just because a student doesn't fit your mold of how you think a student should dress or act, don't assume they are any less intelligent or less of a hard worker. Just because like, a kid wants to dress with pants sagged or a hat backwards or anything like that, don't have a mold in your head that a student has to look and act like this in order to pass my class or do well in my class, because that just isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
I think from
Yeah,
the...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Truman.
I just think we fall into that trap of judging, and I might even be guilty of this. And this has been a really eye-opening class for me, I think, of judging them on their ability to cross over to that to our cultural norms. It is like somehow we're judging their success or their well-spoken or their, I think that examine that bias and not judging people by not assuming what their cognitive level is or their motivation is by how they look and how they act is huge.
Yeah, I was looking in the Yoso text and it references like highlighting and applauding the capitals as they occur, as you see them. But I thought that was interesting because I think if someone were to read that and try to like highlight a positive use of cultural capital that they see, it could go like dead wrong. So if you're like, wow, that was so, whatever of you. And they're like, what did you expect me to be otherwise? So I think that could be a little dangerous, but I thought it would be easiest for us, like in the beginning of the year with the familial capital, just valuing culture. That's like one of the easiest gateways, in my opinion, in the classroom to start showing value for everyone's culture through family connections.
I'll add, just kind of going back to the part where we said it kind of with the dress, how I read about that in the article. They come with saggy pants or hat backwards, like Justin said, like don't think that they can't learn. And I feel like that's like something that I've always been good about is, like I said, like holding the highest expectations for learning for all my students. But here's like where I could fall short is this kind of goes to the article we read later on. I think one of the Gloria Billings ones. But how like school uniforms. That's a whole other thing later on about pedagogy, poverty. But my first school was school uniform school for elementary, but they didn't do anything. Like they were not like middle school where they'd send you to ISS and I'd call and change. But I had one kid at least 2-3 times a week would wear whatever he wanted. I mean, like Nikes and go all out with these like nice shirts. And so I saw him as like, okay, you're breaking a rule. Like, you're breaking the easiest rule of the school is to come with the uniform on. So you're going to break rules in my classroom. Like, you're going to cause trouble. And he did, but I knew that from day one. Like, okay, you can't follow this simple rule of the school from the start of walking in. Then how are you going to act in my classroom? And so, like, that highest expectation was for all the kids to wear the uniform, but he was never upheld to it. So, like, I, try to do it in my classroom, but that's just where it comes into the fact, like, okay, do I keep pushing, like, this is a school rule, or do I just let him dress how he wants because that's what he expresses himself as? That's his culture. That's what he doesn't want taken away. So, I don't know. I find that really interesting because I kind of battle with that at times.
Absolutely.
And sometimes those are self-fulfilling prophecies. It's like you expect that from them, and then they just kind of fill that expectation.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely have mixed feelings about uniform schools, for sure. Because I know at my school,
so I wasn't sorry, I was bringing it up kind of early, but it kind of falls in line with the dominant culture and how people kind of use it to mellow that out.
That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Have you guys ever heard of Dr. Adolph Brown?
mm-hmm.
He's a professional development guy, speaker. And he came and spoke to our district when I was working in Colorado. And he's obviously a doctor he's a behavior scientist. He's a teacher. And he's got he's the one who kind of coined that balcony teachers. Really talks about, being really super positive and such. But the thing that's interesting about him is he's a Black guy, and when he's out, and so here we are in Colorado, we probably have 2% teachers of color in our group, and as well as students for that matter, and it's the whole district. And this guy is out there, and nobody knows who he is, but he's got on a baseball hat, he's got his pants hanging down, he's got big tan boots on, and he's kind of hanging out in the front, when we're all kind of mingling. And nobody knows who this guy is or why he's there. He obviously doesn't fit in. And then he talks about that dynamic of how he's treated, how he was treated. And it was pretty fascinating when he peels that off and he's, and gets up on that stage and starts talking. But yeah, it was interesting.
It was interesting.
Justin went to church. There he is.
Back.
How was church?
All right.
He's like Truman's starting to talk. It's a good time to go to the bathroom. It's going to be a while.
No, I just don't want to blow my nose on screen.
Okay, what is the pedagogy of poverty is our next question.
Sorry, I don't want to start first every time, but I love this article. I thought it was to a T of so much that I could relate to from working in such multicultural classrooms. But I also just once I read, I kind of like to Google certain questions just to kind of see other feedback and whatnot. So really basic. After you read this long article, I don't know if I maybe just misread over what she just defined pedagogy of poverty is. There's she kind of described different ways, but when I did this one article, the guy's name is Martin Haberman, but he calls pedagogy of poverty where pedagogical practices tend more towards giving information and controlling behavior than creating spaces where students identify questions, make meaning, and solve world problems. So I guess, yeah, that kind of goes along with, the things they were doing were supposedly to help these poverty schools, improve in their academics or whatnot, but a lot of it was just controlling what they saw as behavior. So, I thought it was so interesting to read about how they don't want to work or they don't value education, school uniforms. I can go to that too, but especially the scripted curriculum when they said that for urban schools, when I worked in Duval County, one of the worst schools in the state of Florida for 3 years, it was, especially our reading and math actually too for second grade. I mean, scripted to a T, and it was so boring. And I would definitely follow it because I was a new teacher that was scared to go off the beaten path, but I would try to make something more exciting, but then I was just so exhausted with everything else. I didn't have it in me. But I'm just is this really what they need? I think they like these scripted curriculums because it keeps it at a level playing field for all kids. They really use it for data comparison and whatnot. But I just did not see the kids getting anything out of it.
This was really relevant for me too. And I thought it was just, I had a little bit of a misunderstanding, not as much as classroom. I kind of was leaning towards more how we treat them in the classroom and how we reinforce that separation due to wealth rather and their feelings of inadequacy. But also it was kind of eye-opening reading the article about all the different ways, like institutionally, they kind of go back to that video, Dr. Fowler's video, as far as making resources available and what you offer, as far as what's available to students in an inner city versus suburban schools.
One of the talking points I had written down for this is the Howard and the ULLUCCI author said that teachers can further exacerbate poor students' feelings of I don't know how to. My words are fumbling today.
Inadequacy. I have the same quote.
Yes, through the tasks they assign and experiences they provide. So, basically, one thing that growing up, my teachers in high school did a lot of is they were very timid to assign research-based things outside of the classroom. So if they assigned research stuff, because I grew up in a school district that the majority of students were on free and reduced lunch. The teachers didn't want to assign that stuff because they didn't want to ask the question, well, who here doesn't have a computer at home, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one thing that I tend to do too. Well, math is a little bit easier because there's not really too much research-based writing that goes on in my classroom. But one of the things that I do is Kahoot activities. And last year, I asked the students one time, I was like, well, if you just have a cell phone, get your cell phone out and you can play Kahoot that way. And then everybody was getting their cell phones out. And then I was like, oh crap, now I have to ask the question, well, who doesn't have a cell phone? That way I can get you a Chromebook. And when I asked that question, 2 kids' hands went up, and it wasn't that they were, I don't know their economic status, but it was just dang, I feel bad that I asked that question and had to single them out. But they were good sports about it, and they were just oh, my cell phone's broken or this and that. It wasn't a big deal. So,
or even the simple things what do you want for Christmas? What are your plans? What did you do this summer? And then you get the kids that are all we went to Greece, we went here, we went there. And, and then there's always the kids in the class that were I played video games. I've never been out of the state, never been on an airplane, just assuming kids have been on an airplane or to the ocean,
Oh, I'd never flown until I was 19 years old.
Yeah.
I think as teachers, we just have to be, I think just not setting in our heads an assumption, because I use in my math classroom, we use Google Classroom as a platform. And if you don't have access to technology, you're not going to be able to complete your assignments. But with that said, holding them to that high expectation, I give them so many options and so many opportunities to have access to the laptop cart in our classroom. It's never a question of okay, who has their phone today? It's get whatever you need. If you need a partner, if you need to share it, if you need to grab a laptop, you know what you have to do. If you need to come during lunch, if you come before school, if you come after school to borrow it. And then it's if you have a personal issue, you come see me privately and we'll figure something out. And I've definitely found ways to loan laptops and tablets to students that don't have it. And then even beyond that, some kids have a phone, but they don't have data. So it's I think it's just in that precedent that you all are going to be held accountable, but I'm going to support you so that you can meet my expectations no matter how high they are.
You are going to differentiate for their needs.
How much time do we spend removing barriers, man, as teachers?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a little slightly off, but I'm a little different from you guys because we are one-to-one iPads from grades 2 through all the way up through high school. And we find that in at my school, at least, the divide is not between who has the access to the technology, because they all do, because they're all one-to-one. It's who treats the iPad like a toy because they don't have a toy one at home. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, they don't have a play one at home. So when they see an iPad, you know, they're going off of what they saw in the commercials or what they see kids with iPads doing outside of school. So you can tell who has one for home and who has a school one and who just has a school one. It's a very interesting dynamic to watch unfold.
So do they take the school one home and like do things on it they shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, they can take it home whenever they want. It's like basically theirs for the year, but you'll find that students who don't have another one will like mess around on the school one at home or at school. It doesn't really matter. Whereas the ones who have one at home, they're like over it. Like they're like, this is my school, and I don't care, whatever.
I get what you're saying now.
So it's weird to watch, but yeah. So even when you're one-to-one, you got crazy stuff like that happening too.
Do you use like different strategies to kind of like show them how it's a tool?
We try. It does end up sometimes becoming like you just can't have it anymore, which is terrible, and that's something we have to like go through. They sign a contract, so thank goodness. It's not like I took it from them. It's like you weren't respecting the contract, so the principal took it from you. But yeah, it's very much just, okay, you can't have it anymore. But
and then also, I was going to kind of get y'all's thoughts on this too, just I'm interested. I always go back to like how the Pedagogy of Poverty article, I should like list the different things, like, you know, this y'all's like the lies about children poverty. But what is y'all's view on school uniforms? What do you think about those? Because I feel like even like very high SES schools have uniforms, so I don't always see it as a poverty issue or a poverty thing.
But could it be unintentionally? You know, I don't know what, because you're asking them to dress like essentially like the dominant, you know. I don't know. That's interesting. I mean, I would have given you a totally different answer before this class.
yes, I agree with that. I feel like I'd have to experience it to have a really solid perspective, and I haven't experienced anything like that yet.
It almost feels like robbing some of the kids of their identity. But I don't know.
So I can talk to school uniforms a little bit. The kids at my high school experience school uniforms every grade level except for when they hit high school. So when they come to high school,
oh Lord,
they're 14 years old, 13 years old, and they are now just able to express themselves for the very first time in a school. And you can, like, last year I was blown away. There is like no dress code at my school. Okay, you have girls coming in with like hardly nothing on, belly showing, guys coming in with, you know, pants however they want them. You know, like I had a kid one time, remember we're in Hawaii, right? Like it gets hot. There's guys that walk around campus with no shirts on, like just no shirts. Like they're hot. They take their shirts off. They walk around. And then when they come to class, the teacher asks them to put their shirt on, and they put their shirt on. Like, because we have an open campus. It's almost like a college campus. So I don't know, just for like school uniforms, I think it should be like if it's going to be a thing, you know, K through 12 in your district, because once you give those students like the free reign, like for the first time in high school, they don't know what to do with it. I personally don't like school uniforms at all. But like to just implement it at the high school level where mom and dad can't necessarily tell them anymore, hey, don't wear that, because they'll give them an attitude and out the door they'll go. Like it needs to be something that like if they're going to have that free will, they need to start maybe at the middle school level or something because oh my goodness, it's like we have a campus of 2,000 students and it's crazy to see some of the things that these students come in sometimes.
I bet.
And my school is very similar to that, but I feel like the whole district voted on like high schools having uniforms, so it's very broad what they're able to wear, which I like. They can't wear like specific like gang related colors, and then they have to wear like certain colors of pants and like certain colors of collared shirts. Like the collared thing, like we could debate that, but at the same time, if you walked into my school, it looks like distance. Like there's kids wearing things that make me uncomfortable, like with them in my classroom, but nothing's enforced at my school. So like literally a girl came to class the other day at the end of the year and like had no bra on, was wearing like a crop top and like pants, like shorts. I could see her butt. And I like my first question was like, do you have a sweater? Because like walk into class like that, but at the same time I know if I send her somewhere they're not going to do anything. It was the last period of the day, and so I feel like there has to be a line, but the line shouldn't maybe be the typical like white societal like I don't know how to explain it, but like there has to be a line somewhere where it's just like you're exposing too much of your body and it's distracting on the class.
Well, and then you imagine with everything that's going on, again, this is where society creeps into the schools. Imagine being a white teacher. I'm not white. I'm sorry. Imagine being a male teacher trying to have those conversations and you're instantly the creeper while you're looking at that, kind of. And so it's like, so that's, so that's, the whole victim shaming and all of these things come into play. Man, there's so much at work.
Now try being 22 and teaching at the high school for the first time. I'm like, can you go like down to the counselor's office and see if they have like an extra shirt for you to wear or something? Like it's because so here's the thing. One of the guys I teach with, he's probably in his 40s. He actually had we have a thing called Text a Tip, and it's like an anonymous way for students to text the vice principals if they suspect something going on. Well, they got a text a tip that this teacher like looked at, like the girl said, Mr. So-and-so looked at me the wrong way. Well, they investigated it, like the principals and stuff, and the girl never came in. And he's like, well, I didn't like think I was looking at her the wrong way. Maybe she took it that way. But like after the investigation, like there was like some things that were hit on, like he just assigned a big project and just graded it, and that girl specifically had gotten a bad grade. So did her best friend. So like it's like, okay, is there a cause of them saying this about him because they received a bad grade on his assignment? Like that's scary to me to think. Like I don't know. It's like, man, if I give a student a wrong assignment, what are they going to say about me? It's like, teaching such a ice skating field.
I can kind of go into the next question too.
Yep, go for it. So how can teachers disrupt the pedagogy of poverty within middle to high income and low income schools? I feel like we started to touch on it. So yeah, if you want to.
So I was thinking with that, like same thing with the whole dress code thing. It's like, say a girl comes in your class with her pretty much body parts showing, and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to send you somewhere to get something else. And they're out of the classroom. Then they feel they can't trust you because you're sending them away from the classroom, from learning, and then from, being singled out and all this. Like, I'm thinking of that just example that you shared, but I know like the same things happen with kids, 7 years old, things they've done. And so I guess it all just comes down to, if you want to disrupt it, as you just, even through all that teachers have to juggle and battle with making sure everything's met is just trying to like build relationships. Like if you get to send a student out like later, have this love and logic talk with them and be like, do you understand, why I did this? And like, I don't disrespect you anymore because of it or something like that. But it's just like, I think it just takes time. And again, it's easier said than done to build relationships, especially when you have like if you're in high school and you have 100-some students versus me, I'm with the same 25 kids all day, every day. So it's different. I know when people are hard, when you have more students, but I just think like, of course you can go against things that you can share your views with your admin or your district if you don't like certain things like they do, if they do scripted curriculum or if they do uniforms, but just advocating and saying, this is why I think this could be better for these types of students, and just always being there to advocate for them.
Yeah, I just shared for that question. I was looking at an article that draws parallels between good teaching and project-based learning, and just basically saying that that's the key to battling the pedagogy of poverty. And it's just project-based or problem-based work in the classroom.
That's interesting too.
Yeah. All right. Do we want to move on?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. If your students are from high socioeconomic status groups, how can educators still counter a pedagogy of poverty? I feel like those questions are very similar, but we can combine them.
One of the articles talked about the individual faults myth. I don't know if any of you guys have that written down for this question, but like it says, moreover, we know that many families who are in poverty are headed by working adults. They are still poor. The majority of the poor people in the study were not unemployed. Rather, they were poorly paid, underemployed, or working part-time. Thus, the problem is not that those in poverty are lazy or unmotivated, but they have low wage and too few jobs problems. So, like the myth is like, oh, you're poor because you like are lazy,
you don't
work. And that's like not the case. Like there's families that are, like I said, headed by working parents, and those parents just can't find a job that pays enough to support the family that they have. And they're oftentimes having to work, because they need to work more hours. They can't get a full-time job with benefits. They have to work 2 or 3 part-time jobs just so they're working all the time to provide.
That's exactly what I put for the American Dream question.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. For this question, one notion that I thought was interesting that I'd never really heard before is the idea of othering. And so rather than kind of focusing on differences between socioeconomic status groups, kind of moving towards commonalities of people in general was something they talked about in the article about poverty.
Yeah, so the first time I read the article, I was like, the question, I was confused. I was like, well, how can if there's a high SES group, how could there be a pedagogy of poverty? Because poverty is the opposite of high SES. But then I think it was like saying, there can still be ways of the pedagogy of poverty with high SES places. So I guess like kind of same thing, people may view the poverty, people in poverty does not want to work. We said that, for being lazy, or they don't value education or something like that. So I think like say you have high SES, it may be the opposite. Like you may think, oh, these students will work so hard, their parents do, because they obviously made money to get them here, when that's not always the truth either. Like they still need, even if their parents got them there and they go to the high SES school, don't assume that they will be like that, because they may not be the hardest workers or something. So it's kind of just applying that to a different group of SES.
We don't have time to go into it today, but an interesting thought maybe as we just kind of reflect on the readings would be, is it easier to teach in a school that has both groups represented, or that's primarily all low SES?
I love that question.
Yeah.
right. So anybody else about the American dream, or is it only about working hard?
Oh
I
yeah.
feel like we've covered a bunch in a short time there.
The only thing I added, the only thing I had for that was that, like, to me, that, and again, a takeaway from this class is like that whole idea. That's what everybody goes to when you talk about privilege. Is I didn't work, I worked hard for what I got, you know, or, and even my parents live in the inner, you know, in St. Louis. They're having a lot of struggle with crime and things like that, and they have a big disparity between the haves and the have-nots. I think, and her feeling is, why don't those kids just reach down and grab themselves by the bootstraps and change their change their life. They don't have to do crime, they don't have to do drugs, you know, and things like that. And I think that is like really a foundation. The belief that it is that the American dream is accessible to all is like a foundational, like passively aggressive or a passively racist attitude that I don't think people even realize they have, you know.
I just caught myself doing that like a couple months ago. I was talking to some other like first and second year teachers, and they had like a whole bunch of supplements. So they're like making a ton of money this year, I thought. And I was like, how have you not been able to save? And like my immediate thought was like, you're not saving your money wisely. And then they're like, oh, well, I'm actually like helping my mom like pay for her rent. And then my sister's having this issue. And I was like, your family is so close, where like my parents were like, once I turned 18, like you're on your own. And I never thought of like having dependents at like, even though you're single, like having dependents that you're taking care of monetarily.
And I think it goes back to I think it was with one of these classes. Maybe it was when I took, I can't remember which one it was, but Truman, you said it, the quote that came from Martin Luther King, how whenever they interviewed him and how he's like, you know, people after slavery and, you know, blacks were establishing whatever, becoming parts of society, that they thought the playing field was completely even. And he was like, and I can't remember the MLK quote, but it was like something, you know, they were pick yourself up by your bootstraps and move on. But he's like, but they weren't given boots, or however he words it. So it's like, you know, and I was the same way, literally all the way through high school. Like it seemed like I kind of grew up in a multicultural place, but if people weren't working hard, or like they didn't have as much as I had, like growing up, I'm like, well, their parents just didn't work hard enough. Like that kind of sucks, but maybe they'll change it. Like that was my view definitely through adolescence. And then once I got to college and, you know, matured, I definitely see that it's not that easy. It's easier said than done with the American dream and your opportunities presented to you. So, yeah, kind of goes along with what you're all saying. Yep. I'm about to look up that quote.
I got it.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
It's a good one. It's a cruel joke to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It's even worse to tell a man to lift himself up by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boots.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right. What is the educational debt? And then it says discuss all components of the debt.
I thought it was interesting just because when I first read educational debt, I'm like, oh, money. You know, we have national debt, people have debt, they owe student loans, whatever else. But, you know, I realized it's debt, which is saying like a deficit. It's like, where are we falling short? Not just numerically debt. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I thought it was really interesting. Obviously, you know, I don't have to go into all the certain parts, but, you know, names like historical debt, economic debt, socio-political debt, and then moral debt. Mm-hmm. So the one that kind of like seemed interesting to me was, of course, economic debt, which is what I first thought it would be. So I'm paying attention to that because that's what I first, you know, thought the whole everything was. But Alex said, like, Chicago public schools spend about $8,482 per pupil, while nearby Highland Park spends $17,291 per pupil. And I'm like, what are they paying for that these students cost $17,000? Like, do they each get an iPad? Do they each get, I just don't know. I mean, I guess the technology in the school, I guess I'm like, that includes their lunch food. I'm just like, that's a lot of money per person.
It made me curious about like my own statistics, and I don't know where I would even begin to locate that. But like within our own districts, like what, I'm gonna spend time looking that up later. But yeah, I was like, dang, I'd love to be able to compare my own situation to whatever is going on there.
Mm-hmm.
See, I missed it in the reading, but I just pulled it out of the video of
Mm-hmm.
where she said that the educational debt is what's owed to students of color for all the resources that have never been provided to them over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And kind of go back to the other one was historical debt. And again, this is kind of like where this can kind of go into the American dream or the opportunities presented, because it's like they document how the legacy of educational inequities in the United States. So those inequities initially were formed around race, class, gender. Gradually, some of the inequities began to recede, but clearly they persist in the realm of race. And so I think they still persist in race and class. I mean, but I think in America, it's especially race. So
one thing that I had down for historical was the fact that the major leaders of our nation, dating back to like the 1800s, like Thomas Jefferson, who advocated for education of the American citizen, simultaneously decried the notion that blacks were not capable of education. Even George Washington maintained that he maintained slaves, and then gave no thought to educating enslaved children. So like the fact that the historical consensus is that, they were never equal to white people. That's the historical debt that we have.
When I read this article, when I think of debt, or like even if you have like a bunch of credit card debt, it's like, which credit card do you tackle first? And I was like, which debt would I tackle first to have like the highest impact? And I thought it was like the socio-political debt, because then once like there's opposing views like in positions of power, then I felt like they could equitably tackle the other types of debt.
Mm-hmm.
Like that kind of makes sense of why we want our students to be so socio-politically conscious, so that they can go and like kind of fight that debt.
And kind of how it's said too in the political debt, how it reflects the degree to which communities of color are excluded from the civic process. So it does say civic, but I just first thought like government process. And yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just thinking like community leaders. I mean, I know it differs depending on where you are and in your city or state or whatnot, but I'm just like looking at Congress, like how after those elections, this is the first time they had X amount of color people representing, blacks, whites, Latinos, Middle Easterners. So I just think that it just shows like now in 2019, if we're just now having this more diverse set that are representing, our country as a whole, like how long they've been waiting for that, because we've had that diversity for quite some time, but now it's just what's starting to come on to the surface.
So continuing on from that, how does school funding shape educational activities? I got to this one, started thinking about, because I teach at a Title I school, and like what impacts that has, because I'll sit across from teachers who are at non-Title I schools, and they're like, they'll give us a new resource out of professional development or something, and I'll be like, okay, we have like 75 of these in the hallway, you're like down, over there. And then the teacher across from me would be like, oh yay, we get a geo board. And I'm like, what? We have so many of these, but then we have to keep them in a certain place. And like, I'm just curious about how that impacts Title I versus non-Title I schools and the kids that go to them. Why these kids can have free breakfast in the classroom and these don't. I don't know. I think it's like when you see a Title I school, it's like a blanket statement, and then that causes confusion for me as a teacher, I guess. And that's one thing I thought about when I was looking at this question.
Mm-hmm.
I just looked at the big model, the big picture of basing it on property taxes and dividing it by wealth. Basing it on wealth in a geographical area, and then it just seems by its nature to to divide, and that comes into play a lot. Like as a special ed teacher, because we have federal funding, there's a lot of access I have to resources that the gen ed teachers in my same school don't have access to, like with even just professional development and getting sent to things. It's federal money. So there just seems to be a big overarching problem.
Yeah.
And I think too with school funding, again, like sometimes they'll say, if I were a Title I school and like, oh, well, that receives federal money, like the technology we had. And like I said, my first year teaching, my students had one-to-one Chromebooks. They couldn't take them home though. They had to stay in the classroom. But, we didn't have that when I was in high school, and I went to a pretty well-funded school and public school, but I was just like, wow, these kids have Chromebooks at all times, like whatever. But then they would, the money would go to these things, but like I never had school supplies, never had pencils, Kleenexes. I had to buy toilet paper for my kids. Like it was ridiculous. And so, some people are like, oh, well, don't you get like great funding for things, even though, it's a hard school and hard community? And I'm like, no, like we have Chromebooks and cool technology, but besides that, like the basic necessities that they need to function in this classroom, I buy out of my own pocket. I mean, hundreds of dollars. And so it's just like, people may think because and it did shape their education. It definitely was, shape their education. And I think it was not equal, but it's just so different with funding. Is it by state? Is it federal? Is it property tax dollars? Is it PTA giving money? Just so many factors that can go into how it's processed in school.
I always go back to like the whole educational funding. Like sometimes I don't think money is the answer. Like yes, I've taught in like a classroom where there's no technology whatsoever, and I'm purchasing my own expo markers on like a 4-foot by 5-foot dry erase board for a class of 30 students. But I feel like the biggest factor is not like the technology that the kids have access to or how many school supplies they have access to. In the end, I feel like it's the quality of the teacher that is in front of the class. And to me, like the underfunding, like if we could fund better teachers to be in front of kids in Title I schools, I think that would start to level the playing field a little bit.
Yeah,
I agree.
So our last bullet point here, we've all actually started working on, so we should be pretty up to date on it. The book Waking Up White. What can be learned from the book thus far?
I guess I can go to. So she describes. I read on my iPad. I have an ebook, and I should have brought it with me to send my notes. But so much of what she describes her growing up reminds me so much of like what my mom has told me about when she grew up. I think they're right on the same age. So I remember like when I was younger, we were learning about the civil rights movement. Like I remember asking my mom, be like, Mom, like how was that? Like, in the 60s and stuff when you were in elementary school. And she would kind of like tell me she doesn't remember a lot, but like literally so much reminds me of like what our parents or my parents went through growing up. And just how sometimes like I feel like I don't know much about my identity of white, how it, affects me now. But I've learned so much. But I'm like, think about them like at her age as author and back in that time. Like I bet it was just so different. And you just realize so much more now in today's world than they did back then.
I was nervous when I first started the book because I thought it was going to make me frustrated. Because, sometimes it's too much. It's like, okay, all right, okay, we get it. But I've been like pleasantly surprised that it's been pretty neutral. Like appears to, through her writing, be pretty empathetic to the reader. So I appreciate that. And I like the questions at the end.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm like, that doesn't really relate to me at all. But some I'm like, okay, I appreciate that. That's a good question.
I think it's just reminding me that like this is all like it's just a process, And I think it's cool how she laid the book out as her going through the process, and you can see her kind of like spiral back and then spiral up and spiral back and spiral up as she's like continually working on just this realization.
And she's pretty typical. She's pretty relatable because I think that's the experience that a lot of us have had.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. Good.
Go team.